As I told you, this is not a traditional place. We know for sure that this is the same garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means the olive press, because they have discovered a lot of olive presses over here in this area. This is where everybody came to press their olives. This is where the name comes from. This is where Jesus was pressed, if you want to make the relation. And so we know that it was one of the two places where Jesus spent his nights while in Jerusalem. Exactly underneath us, there is a cave which is called the Cave of Gethsemane. And that's where he was betrayed by Judas. See, later, when we are done over here, maybe we can walk down to that cave and see the cave, which is the place where he spent his night and where he was betrayed by Judas. This is where Judas brought the Roman soldiers. And when we go to the other section of the garden, we're going to see some old olive trees that dates back to the time of Jesus, even earlier, prior to that. So we're going to do the reading, but a lot of people would relate this to the very beginning, to the Garden of Eden, where the first sin started. That first sin was forgiven or was healed at the Garden of Gethsemane over here, when Jesus decided to take that cup, the cup of redemption or the cup of forgiveness.
Beginning in verse 39. He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he arose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray, that you may not enter into temptation." And that's Dr. Luke's account, the physician. And he made sure to point out that his sweat became like great drops of blood. The medical diagnosis of this would be hematidrosis. And it's where the patient or the victim is under so much duress and distress and agony and grief that literally the tiny capillaries and the blood vessels mix with the sweat and they burst. And he's literally sweating blood and water, as we've heard about this week also. And that shows us how much agony and distress Jesus was under on that particular night. In Matthew's account, it says that he told his disciples, "My heart is sorrowful, even unto death." That tells us the heaviness that was on his heart, the grief. And then he took Peter, James, and John on in a little further with him, his inner circle of his disciples. But even they fell asleep. So I'm going to be very brief, but just one thing before we all go and pray. The closest ones to him, on the one night that he asked them to be there for him, they fell asleep.
So this is, guys, the other section of the Garden of Gethsemane. So it's the same garden, and this is where we have a church that was built in 1924. It's relatively a new church, but it was built exactly on top of that huge rock. There was a huge rock over here that was cut from the sides actually to build this church. And that rock is traditionally the place where Jesus fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." And so we know that he took with him 3 disciples and he left 8 at the cave on the other side of the garden. And Judas was already, he was not with them because he left the meal before it was over. So 11 disciples came with Jesus from the upper room down the Kidron Valley to the cave of Gethsemane. He left 8 there, and he took Peter, James, and John. When was the time before the Garden of Gethsemane? Earlier, that Peter, James, and John were with Jesus. The Transfiguration. When he went up to the top of the mountain and he transfigured, he took with him Peter, James, and John. And he was preparing those 3 disciples because he knew that they are the ones that we will be with him in the garden at that night. So he brought Peter, James, and John with him. He asked them to stay awake and watch for him. What you need to know is that the night of Passover in the Old Testament was the night of watching. In Egypt, that's when the Israelites stayed awake watching for the destroying angel. And this is what Jesus told his disciples: stay awake and watch with me. He went a little bit further. He fell with his face to the ground and he prayed, "Father, let this cup pass from me. Your will, not mine, to be done." As I told you, if Jesus wanted to escape from the Romans, that was not a big deal. He could have walked up to the top of the Mount of Olives, which is only 10 minutes walk, and from there to the Judean wilderness, that the Romans had no presence over there, which means that that was a perfect hiding place for Jesus. But he knew that he is the one that must drink that cup. So when the angel appeared to him, and as a lot of people say, that the angel appeared to him and he handed him that cup, that 4th cup. And Jesus realized that this is the time for the scriptures to be fulfilled. He came to the 3 disciples who were asleep and he woke them up. He was like, "It's all over. My betrayer is close at hand." He took the 3 disciples, they went to the cave of Gethsemane, and they waited for Judas to come, who betrayed him by a kiss. Now what you need to know is that in our culture till today, when I meet like a really close friend, we won't shake hands. Like the men would kiss on the cheek. This is how you greet a really close friend. So when Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, that was a sign. I mean, he had a good relation, that good trust relation between the two. And that's why he told the Romans, "The one I kiss," because of that strong relation between Jesus and Judas. And so these are the same trees that existed in the garden at that night and witnessed everything that happened in the garden: the prayers, the agony, and the betrayal of Jesus. If you look, you see how big the trunks of some of the trees are. They're really huge trees, and this is how we know that these are thousands and thousands of years old. So we have 8 olive trees that date back to that period. We're just gonna see the cave where Jesus was arrested, Gethsemane. This is the only cave like in this area over here. And this was identified as the place where Jesus spent a lot of his nights while in Jerusalem. And this is the place where he waited for Judas to come. So this is where he was arrested, at the cave of Gethsemane. We have place, this is a Greek Orthodox church that is called the Tomb of the Virgin Mary. Now, actually the New Testament does not say much about what happened to Mary after the resurrection of Jesus. And she died in Jerusalem and was buried in Jerusalem. And this was identified as the burial place of Mary. So it's like you walk flight of stairs all the way down. At the bottom on the right you see a sarcophagus, which is believed to be the place where she was laid. Even the Greek Orthodox tradition that says that she was buried over here says that later she was assumed body and soul into heaven. And this is the tradition that the Catholic Church accepted, that she was assumed body and soul into heaven. So this was identified as the burial place of the Virgin Mary. This is what we call the Old City of Jerusalem. The walled area is what we call the Old City of Jerusalem. You can see the Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah, or what is called nowadays the Noble Sanctuary. It unfortunately is closed for visitors because of the Muslim feast, because of Ramadan. The Kidron Valley that separates the Old City of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives where we are. Now, we talked about the Jewish Passover, we talked about the hundreds of thousands of Jews who came to Jerusalem during the Passover week. Again, Josephus talks about 2.7 million who came to Jerusalem during the Passover week. And of course, there was not enough place for them to stay in the Old City of Jerusalem or in the City of Jerusalem. Besides that, not everybody could afford that. Especially that, just like today, the prices in Jerusalem during the Jewish feasts went up back at that time. So all those thousands of people, pilgrims, the Jewish pilgrims, camped on the Mount of Olives over here. That was called the Mount of Olives in the first place because of the thousands of olive trees that once existed on the Mount of Olives. They were all uprooted in the year 70 by the Roman soldiers to burn the temple in the city of Jerusalem. I don't want to say that it happened every year, but it happened a lot. That when all those thousands are gathering on the Mount of Olives, one crazy person showed up on top of the Mount of Olives and claimed to be the Messiah. Fine. Back at that time, the Jews had nothing to lose. You know, they did not have control over their holy city, Jerusalem. They did not have freedom of movement from one place to another place. They are treated as second-class citizens by the Romans. They had to pay high taxes to the Romans. So when that person showed up, that was for them the Messiah, the Redeemer. Because they always associated the Passover with the coming of the new Messiah, the coming of the new Moses, that the Old Testament prophets proclaimed or talked about. So when that person showed up on top of the Mount of Olives, as the Old Testament prophecy says, Zechariah chapter 14 and Joel chapter 3, that the Messiah will come from the east, he's going to walk down from the top of the Mount of Olives to the Kidron Valley. Do you know what the Kidron Valley is called in Hebrew? Jehoshaphat, the valley of Jehoshaphat, which means in Hebrew, God judge. Because in rabbinical tradition, the judgment will take place down in this valley. Okay? According to the Muslim tradition, judgment will take place up on top of this mountain, at the four sides of that building. You remember the cave that was formed by, the ascension of Muhammad? And in the rock, did I tell you this? Yeah. So when Muhammad ascended to heaven, the rock got stuck to his feet. The angel came and put it down. That formed the cave that they call nowadays the cave of the souls. And so when someone dies, his soul goes and hides inside that cave, which is underneath the building with the gold dome. According to Islamic tradition, at the judgment day, God will place the scales on which he will judge people on the four sides of that building. And so people will be called one by one from that cave to receive their judgment on one of the scales. And that's why they are always want to be buried by the walls, which is the closest point to where the judgment is. According to Jewish belief and rabbinical tradition, that the judgment will take place down in this valley. That's why a lot of people identify this valley as the valley of Armageddon, because of the prophecies in Zechariah and Joel that the Messiah will come from the east. He's going to get to the top of the Mount of Olives. Of course, the Messiah cannot walk on tombs. The Mount of Olives will be split into two. The Messiah will walk in between. Everybody who was buried over here is going to rise from the dead. That's why it costs a fortune to reserve a place to bury someone over here, at the Jewish cemetery over here. Because according to what many believe, that if you are buried over here, you're going to be the first to rise from the dead and walk with the Messiah as he walks down to the valley of judgment to receive the judgment, and then the Messiah will walk up to go through that door, which is the Golden Gate or the Eastern Gate, to enter into the city of Jerusalem. So that gate will be opened when the Messiah returns, according to the belief of a lot of people. Maybe you have noticed that many of the tombs at the Jewish cemetery are closed, like small. They do not fit the human body. Why is that? They are buried vertical, standing, facing Jerusalem, ready to walk with the Messiah as he walks down to the valley of judgment. Okay, so this is the belief of the people. Even 2,000 years ago, when those Jewish pilgrims came to Jerusalem and they camped on the Mount of Olives, they all were expecting the Messiah to come. And so it happened a lot that when they are camping over here, one crazy Jewish person would show up on top of the Mount of Olives and claims to be the Messiah. Fine, they had nothing to lose back at that time. They will think, okay, let's give it a chance, let's give it a try. Maybe he's the one that will give us our freedom from the Romans. They followed that person all the way from the top of the Mount of Olives down to the Valley of Judgment, shouting Hosanna, that we sing nowadays. What's the meaning of the word Hosanna? Freedom, free us, save us, salvation. This is the meaning of the word Hosanna. So they followed that person from the top, shouting Hosanna, all the way down to the Valley of Judgment, as the Old Testament prophecies say, and then throwing the palm branches in front of that person. Why the palm branch? Where do you get palm trees in Jerusalem? You don't. There is no palm trees in Jerusalem. It would have been much easier for them to use the olive branch. Why the palm branch? Because the palm branch was a symbol of freedom in the 1st century. Remember, I told you that all the Jewish pilgrims coming to Jerusalem had to go first to the Jordan River, cross the river from where Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, right? Then walk from there to the city of Jericho. That's where thousands and thousands of palm trees are, right? They will carry the palm branches with them from the city of Jericho and walk through the valley of the shadow of death, chanting or singing the ascent psalms, all the way up to the city of Jerusalem. So they carried, or they brought the palm branches with them from Jericho. Every year they came to Jerusalem simply because they wanted to be ready with the palm branch, the symbol of freedom, in case the Messiah will show up while they are in Jerusalem. When Jesus was at Caesarea Philippi, he told his disciples, this is the last journey for me to Jerusalem. I must die over there. He came to the top of the Mount of Olives and he claimed to be the Messiah. Well, that back at that time was nothing new for the people who were camping on the Mount of Olives. He's another crazy Jewish person claiming to be the Messiah. Still, we have nothing to lose. Let's give it another try, another chance. And so they followed Jesus from the top of the Mount of Olives all the way down to the Valley of Judgment, shouting Hosanna and throwing the palm branches. Maybe something that they did last year or 2 years before that. So they were used to it. And Jesus knew very well that those people are not following him because they believed in him, but because for them he is another chance. And that's why he stopped somewhere over here. He looked over the city of Jerusalem, the city that he loved, the city of God, and he cried because he knew that those people do not believe in him. He cried and he prophesied its destruction when he said, your enemies will lay siege around you. They will dash you and the children inside you to the ground because you did not recognize the day of your visitation. That was when he described the city of Jerusalem by saying that not even one stone will be left upon another. And as I told you, his prophecy was fulfilled in the year 70. When 3 Roman legions laid siege around the city of Jerusalem, they completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They uprooted the olive trees from the Mount of Olives to melt the gold that decorated the temple. And that was when all the stones of the temple fell down to fulfill the prophecy of Jesus. So Jesus stops over here, he cries over the city of Jerusalem that was completely destroyed. By the way, what you see over there, the gold that covers that dome, that's pure gold.
Is it really?
It is. That's $17 million of gold.
Oh, wow.
That was donated by King Hussein of Jordan. But not by the kingdom of Jordan, King Hussein himself. So when you think of the temple, the Herodian temple, that was considered to be the most beautiful building that Herod has ever built, that was decorated with more or less the same amount of gold, solid gold. That justifies why the Romans needed to get that gold. That was a fortune back at that time. They did everything needed to get that gold, and that led to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem as Jesus prophesied.